Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why? Even when surrounded by so many ideas, so much content, books, videos, theories, it still feels like something is missing. No matter how much you try to understand, explain, or even change your life, there's always a quiet feeling that something essential keeps slipping away. And what if what's missing isn't something to be achieved, but something you've simply stopped noticing? There is a kind of reality that doesn't reveal itself through effort. It can't be accessed through more reading, more thinking, or more control. In fact, the more we try to capture it with the mind, the more it slips away. Because what we're used to calling reality is often just a mental projection, a construction based on memories, desires, and interpretations. The mind is an extraordinary tool. It analyzes, organizes, compares, and anticipates, but it is also the one that creates the outlines of psychological time. It is what holds the past as a solid story and the future as an unreachable goal. And in that game, consciousness gets lost. The truth is that we are almost never where life is actually happening. Because while the mind lives between what has already been and what hasn't yet arrived, what we are can only exist in the now. The only real experience, the only one that can truly be lived, is this moment, this exact instant. But this is not just a beautiful concept. It's a key that completely changes how we perceive everything, including reality itself. When we are trapped in the narratives of the mind, we live in a kind of parallel reality, a mental reality that seems real but disconnects us from what's right in front of our eyes, or better yet, within us. It's not about rejecting the mind or stopping thinking. It's about realizing that there is something more silent, more stable, more true, something that doesn't come and go like thoughts, a presence that has always been here, even before any idea appeared. Have you ever felt that? The mind creates versions of reality that seem very real, but they're nothing more than projections, reflections, ideas, interpretations, like images reflected on the surface of water, distorted, unstable, fleeting. And still, we take those images as absolute truths while ignoring what is truly present, what is direct, simple, silent, but rarely recognized. It's not about finding something new. It's about recognizing what has always been here, even when hidden by the mind's distractions. The mind is not satisfied with simply interpreting what is in front of our eyes. It needs to organize, classify, anticipate. It needs to turn the continuous flow of experience into something it can control. And to do that, it creates an essential concept: time. But we're not talking here about clock time, the one used to schedule appointments or measure the interval between events. We're talking about a more subtle and much more influential kind of time, psychological time. The time the mind projects when it relives what has already passed or imagines what is still to come. This time doesn't exist anywhere outside the mind. It can't be touched, measured, or proven outside the inner narrative. The past, in this context, is not a preserved sequence of facts. It's a reconstruction, an echo of what was, mixed with interpretations, emotions, and meanings that change over time. It's like trying to hold on to smoke. The more we try to define it precisely, the more it fades. Memory doesn't preserve reality, it interprets it. And the future, in turn, is a scenario built on desires, fears, and expectations. It doesn't exist. It's an imaginative projection of something that hasn't happened, and that often won't happen as we imagined. The mind uses these two poles, past and future, to create a sense of continuity, a mental timeline where you are the main character, surrounded by events, justifications, and goals. But that's a story, a subjective narrative. And even though this narrative may seem logical, it weakens something essential: our presence. That's why we stay stuck in old episodes that have physically passed but are still emotionally alive. The mind replays, repeats, analyzes, and still feeds resentment, guilt, regrets. And in doing so, the body feels as if everything is happening again, right now. The same goes for the future. Anxiety, restlessness, and tension arise as real responses to something that hasn't even happened and may never happen. Psychological time, then, becomes a continuous cycle of emotional reactions to mental images. The confusion deepens because we identify with this structure. We see ourselves as someone defined by a past, walking toward a future. And this identity molded in time gives us the sense of control, but at the same time it makes us prisoners. Prisoners of memories that no longer serve and expectations that keep us in a state of constant waiting. Without realizing it, we end up living more inside the story of time than in the space where life is actually happening. This identification with psychological time distances us from the only thing that's truly alive, the now. And it's precisely at this point that perception begins to shift. Because if the time created by the mind can be questioned, then maybe our experience doesn't need to be supported by it. The mind, in building this psychological time, bases much of its narrative on something it continuously transforms: memory. And this is where many of us are misled without noticing, because we tend to trust that remembering is the same as reliving something exactly as it was. But is it really? Have you ever wondered if what you remember actually happened the way you believe it did? Have you noticed how a memory can change over time, gain details that weren't there before, or lose parts that once felt essential? That's because memory isn't a faithful recording of the past. It doesn't store reality the way a camera would. It reconstructs. And every reconstruction carries traces of the present in which it's recalled: current emotions, current beliefs, current interpretations. When we recall something, what we're accessing is not a place in time, but a representation created by the mind in the now. It's a thought, supported by sensations and images that seem vivid but, when calmly examined, reveal their fragility. Memory is malleable, and even if part of it is based on real events, it is inevitably filtered. That's why the past, as we feel it today, is more of a version than an unchangeable truth. Despite this, we build much of our identity on top of those memories. We define ourselves by stories: what they told us, what we did, what we suffered, what we lost, what we lacked. And the more we identify with these narratives, the narrower our perception of who we really are becomes. And with that, we start believing that we are a direct consequence of the past, as if we couldn't exist outside the frames it imposes. This attachment to memories limits our inner freedom, because by staying stuck in old versions of ourselves, we close off to what is alive now. We react to the present based on old stories. We judge, fear, avoid, repeat, not by conscious choice, but because the mind insists on projecting the past onto everything we see. And still, these projections seem real, because the mind is skilled at shaping mental images that overlap the present moment. And so, the past shows up not as a fact, but as a lens. And when we don't recognize that lens, we begin to see the now through a distorted filter, believing we're dealing with the world when we're actually dealing with a memory. This distinction is essential, because the way we handle memory can either keep us stuck in a repetitive cycle of suffering or open us to a new perception, one in which we are no longer carrying the past as a burden, but simply recognizing that it is not here. And if it is not here, then where is your real presence? It's interesting to see how much of our decisions, emotions, and even the uneasiness we feel today don't come exactly from what is happening, but from what we believe is going to happen. The mind, when projecting the past, retells stories, but when it projects the future, it tries to control the unknown. And it is in this attempt to control that a new kind of prison arises: conditioned hope. Hope, at first glance, seems like a good thing, But what happens when this hope is always tied to something that hasn't arrived yet? How many times have you waited for something in the future to complete you? A relationship, professional success, an ideal emotional state. The list goes on endlessly. And with it comes the idea that the present moment is just a bridge, something temporary, to something better that is still coming. The problem isn't in wishing for changes or improvements. What imprisons us is the feeling that peace, fulfillment, or the meaning of life can only be found at a future point in time. This creates an inner dynamic where the now is always insufficient. The present stops being lived as reality and starts being treated as an obstacle, a gap between what no longer serves and what is not yet ready. The mind, in doing this, is not only building expectations, it's trying to escape, because the now, in its simplicity and transparency, reveals everything we've been trying to avoid: discomfort, emptiness, lack of answers. And the mind, by projecting an ideal scene for tomorrow, gives us a false sense of direction, as if everything we feel today could be redeemed later. But that later never comes in the way we imagine, because it always happens as now. When tomorrow becomes today, the same mental mechanisms keep operating, delaying presence, postponing fulfillment, recreating dissatisfaction with new justifications. This trap sustains itself on an invisible but strong logic, the belief that something up ahead will set us free from what we're feeling now. But isn't it curious how, even when things turn out as we expected, the feeling of wholeness is temporary? The emptiness returns, and with it, the search for more. This happens because it's not the future that needs to change. It's our relationship with time that needs to be understood. Every expectation projected onto another moment is, in practice, a subtle way of rejecting the present. And when we reject the present, we reject the only place where life actually happens. So, the real question is not just about what we're hoping for, but why we believe we can't find now what we've been looking for. When we project our peace onto the future, we inevitably create the illusion that the present moment needs to be fixed, improved, or overcome. And it's at this exact point that a new distortion arises, the attempt to capture the now with the mind itself. But the now, this living and silent experience that has always been here, is not something that can be grasped as a concept. The mind, with all its ability to analyze, compare, and judge, is a powerful tool for dealing with structures, calculations, language, and planning. However, it was not made to grasp what is essentially simple and direct. The mind works with content. The now is pure context. The mind works with thoughts, but the now comes before any thought. That's why, the more we try to be present with effort, the more we reinforce the feeling of separation. It's like someone trying hard to relax their shoulders. The effort itself already contradicts the desired state. In the same way, trying to reach the now is like chasing your own shadow. Presence is not a goal to be achieved. It is the background that remains when effort stops. This is the subtlest trap. The mind creates the idea that there is a state of presence to be reached, as if it were a reward reserved for those who try hard enough, meditate properly, or eliminate all thoughts. But this attempt already starts from the illusion that presence is absent. The truth is that the now cannot be accessed through the mind because it is not an object of observation, but the space where all observation happens. It's not about being present in the sense of doing something to get there, but about realizing that nothing needs to be done. Awareness is already here, even when the mind is agitated. Presence does not oppose thought. It just doesn't depend on it. This recognition does not require intellectual understanding. In fact, intellectual understanding often becomes an obstacle because it feeds the desire to understand everything before resting. But presence does not need to be explained to be lived. It is as direct as feeling the breath, hearing a sound, or noticing the body resting on the chair. But when we try to turn this into knowledge, we lose contact with what is alive. There is a clear difference between thinking about the now and being in the now, and it is this difference that, when recognized, transforms how we relate to experience. Because everything we're trying to control or mentally organize only holds weight as long as we believe the mind is the center of the experience. But what if it's not? The mind tries to understand the now, but it's the ego that resists it the most. Because the now does not give it continuity. It interrupts the narrative. And it's precisely this narrative that sustains the ego, an identity built on time, on past stories, future projections, comparisons with others, and above all, on what it believes it should be. The ego is not a thing. It is a psychological pattern sustained by identification. It's born from the belief that we are an isolated personality with a linear story who constantly needs to defend itself, prove itself, or become something beyond what it already is. And this continuous movement of placing itself in opposition to the now generates a specific kind of suffering, subtle but constant. A discomfort that is rarely questioned because it has already become part of the background of daily experience. Have you ever felt like you should be somewhere else, being someone else? Have you ever had the impression that your current version of life is not enough, that something is missing, that there's an ideal version of yourself you haven't reached yet? This is not a simple moment of dissatisfaction. This is the ego in action. An internal system that constantly measures, compares, demands, and projects. It doesn't live what is, it lives what is still missing. The pursuit of personal improvement, when driven by this mechanism, is not an expression of awareness, but a disguised form of escape. Because instead of being a genuine movement of expansion, it becomes a continuous process of correction, correcting the past, anticipating the future, improving the identity. And the more this ideal is pursued, the farther away the experience of peace and wholeness seems to be. That's because it isn't found in time, in effort, or in comparison, which is exactly where the ego keeps searching. It is found before all of that. Psychological suffering in this context doesn't come from what happens. It comes from the distance between what is and what the mind believes should be. That comparison is where the ego grows stronger. It is there that frustrations arise, feelings of inadequacy intensify, and constant self-pressure takes hold. The now is never enough for this mental pattern because it doesn't match the ideal that the mind has projected. The mind, guided by the ego, wants to turn the now into a stepping stone, something to be used to get somewhere else, to achieve something else, to become someone else. But in doing so, it rejects the only point where true transformation can happen, reality as it is, unedited. And this raises an inevitable question. If this constant seeking pattern doesn't bring us closer to freedom, then why do we keep following it? If suffering arises from the gap between what is and what the mind believes should be, it's because we've lost contact with what doesn't move, doesn't compare, and doesn't demand anything. Pure awareness. Not intellectual or cognitive awareness, but the silent presence that perceives, that is always here, even when the mind is too busy to notice. This presence doesn't depend on beliefs, past experiences, or future achievements. It doesn't begin when you awaken, and it doesn't end when you get distracted. It doesn't move with thoughts. It observes them. And even when you think you are lost, it is the awareness that notices that feeling. In other words, what you are, truly, has never been absent. It just hasn't been recognized. There is a big difference between being scattered and being absent. Attention can be focused on 1,000 things at once, notifications, tasks, worries, memories, but awareness remains intact. It is present in all experiences, even when it is not consciously perceived. What changes is the focus, not the presence. And when this is understood, you stop searching for what is already here. Looking outside for what can only be found in your own perception is one of the mind's greatest traps. Happiness, freedom, clarity. All of this is already contained in the now. Not because the now gives you these things, but because it is the only place where they can be perceived without distortion. The present moment doesn't need to offer anything to be complete. It already holds everything that is. And even if the mind questions this, saying that something is still missing, that something still needs to be understood, felt, or achieved, it is that same mind that prevents the recognition of what has never moved, what was never lost. True awakening is not about finding something new, but about realizing what has always been here, quietly present behind all the changes. Presence doesn't appear because you searched correctly. It reveals itself when you stop searching in all the places it never was. And when this realization begins to become clear, even if only for brief moments, everything that once felt urgent, confusing, or unreachable begins to lose its grip. Because there's no longer a need to seek shelter in ideas, projections, or promises. There is simply what is, and that by itself is already enough. But for many, this recognition still feels distant, not because it is far away, but because perception is still turned outward, looking for something to confirm its existence. When the mind is turned outward, it interprets time as something linear, a line we walk along, leaving the past behind and moving step by step toward a future still under construction. This is the common narrative. But that narrative doesn't hold up when we begin to observe experience directly. But what if time wasn't a line you walk through, but simply something that passes before you? This question shifts the entire axis of perception. Because what we call time, past, future, duration, isn't something external. It's something that happens within perception itself. Time, as we know it psychologically, is a mental activity, a way for the mind to organize experiences. But perception itself, the act of being aware, is not contained within time. It is not attached to any point on that imaginary line. It simply observes movement. And this reverses everything. It's not the being that exists inside the mind. It's the mind that exists inside awareness. Thoughts arise, unfold, and dissolve within that space that perceives. Emotions come and go. Sensations shift. But what is aware of all this is not moving through time. It is simply present. This reversal of perspective may seem subtle, but its impact is profound. Because from this point on, you stop seeing yourself as someone limited by a personal timeline with a beginning, middle, and end. And you begin to realize that everything you associate with your identity is moving within something that does not change, something that observes but is untouched by what it observes. And when this shift happens, the way we relate to life begins to transform. The pressure imposed by internal schedules, imaginary milestones, existential deadlines, all of it begins to lose strength. The anxiety about reaching somewhere begins to dissolve when clarity arises that there really is nowhere to get to. There is only what is happening now and how you are perceiving it. This clarity doesn't cancel out practical time. The clock still ticks, activities still require structure, but time is no longer at the center of the experience. It becomes just a part of it, like a tool, not a burden. And in this new way of seeing, awareness stops seeking the perfect moment, because it already understands that everything happens within it, not outside of it. When time is no longer at the center of your experience, it becomes easier to see how conditioned we are to live for a distant goal. That familiar idea that there is a final destination called awakening or realization is often just a mental construction, an image projected into the future, kept alive by the constant sense that we are still not enough. This is where one of the most subtle traps of the spiritual path appears, the idea of progress as a rising line, where each experience must lead us to a new level of consciousness, a new achievement, a new validation. But this logic is the same one we use to measure productivity, success, or performance in the external world. And it doesn't apply to what doesn't belong to time. Consciousness doesn't need to evolve. It is not incomplete. What needs to be seen is not a destination to be reached, but a distortion to be undone. Awakening in this context is a recognition that can only happen now. And when it happens, there's no explosion of extraordinary sensations. There is silence. A silence that reveals what was never absent, only hidden. That's why the search, when fed by the mind, never finds rest. Because it begins from the assumption that something essential is missing. It turns the present into a bridge and the self into a project. But presence is not a construction. It doesn't need to be built, only noticed. And the quieter the seeking mind becomes, the clearer it becomes what has always been here. This clarity shows itself when we stop chasing experiences that are supposed to prove who we are. When we stop trying to get somewhere, what remains is not emptiness. It's an unexpected peace that doesn't depend on circumstances or explanations. The real encounter with inner truth is the gradual abandonment of the idea that we need something else to be whole. It is the end of striving and the return to what never left us. And even though this return has no shape or name, it carries something that no mental image can replace. When the idea of achieving something dissolves, what remains is not a feeling of loss, but the realization that everything that once seemed far away was already here and has always been. The end of the search is the collapse of an illusion, the illusion that realization is outside of us, that peace depends on circumstances, that truth is a concept to be absorbed by the mind. The beginning of inner truth happens when we stop treating the now as a means to something greater and start seeing it as the answer itself. This shift in perspective requires honesty. Honesty to recognize that the entire inner movement of trying, comparing, and waiting is actually the only barrier separating us from what is already present, and that this separation, although it feels real, never truly existed. It was just a distraction created by a thought. What you are is here, now, before any effort to understand, before any attempt to change anything. And when that is seen clearly, even for an instant, a kind of silence arises that cannot be manufactured. A silence that does not depend on your environment, on your emotional state, or on what is happening in the world. This silence is not empty. It is complete, because in it, no one is trying to be anything else. There is no past to carry, no future to reach. There is only the direct recognition of reality as it is. And in that recognition, the need to search disappears. Awareness was never absent. It was just covered by too much mental noise. And when that noise is recognized, something in you realizes that nothing needs to be added for you to simply be present. And that is where everything truly begins. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others so they can benefit from this message. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, reflections, and experiences. Thanks again for watching and for joining me. Take care and see you soon.